So Ori Paz, I'm a management analyst with the City of Menlo Park, our sustainability division. Here to talk about our process. We identified some barriers and went through the effort to update our zoning to help electrify existing homes. Okay, great. So today we'll do a little bit of the policy background. We'll highlight those barriers that we identified in our previous garage and setback regulations, as well as the solution that we landed on and how we did it to change the zoning. We'll talk about the zoning ordinance amendments that we made and then the key takeaways. Next slide, please. Am I controlling this or are you controlling this? Okay.
I am, unless you would like to. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's all right. Sorry, I was clicking and then that's okay. So for background, Menlo Park adopted our climate action plan in 2020 with an ambitious goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. It was updated in 2021 to establish priority strategies to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the big goals that we have is to electrify 95% of our existing buildings. This is important for a couple of reasons that others have mentioned, right? You get these great air quality and public health improvements from doing electrification. And we also benefit from having Peninsula Clean Energy provide carbon-free electricity. So every piece of equipment that we transition from gas to electric kind of locks in those GHG emission reductions, and that's kind of what we're all going for, connecting to that clean grid. And so at first, we adopted an all-electric new construction ordinance in 2020, and we were in the process of exploring a version 2.0 for existing building electrification in 2022. And that's when we learned about these regulatory barriers in the zoning. And meanwhile, we've been making efforts to promote voluntary electrification. So we actually did waive permit fees for electrification. We're up to about $80,000 in waived permit fees for electrification permits. We have seen an uptick in permit applications, so that's great. We've also been continuing to improve our online resources and our process and evaluating those barriers. And this is all to try to position ourselves well. We have this tailwind of funding that's coming both from the Inflation Reduction Act, the local incentives from BayREN, Peninsula Clean Energy, and then the City of Menlo Park was awarded $4.5 million from the state for community-wide equitable electrification. And so, we're trying to position ourselves to do this work and make it more smooth for everyone who's helping us to reach these goals. Great. So I won't spend time on this because we've covered it. Yay. So we can go to the next slide. The main focus that we were looking at is related to the heat pump water heaters. So with electrification, right, we're switching from gas to electric equipment. And the thing that we had noticed with heat pump water heaters from input from the public and folks who are doing the work is that this is one of the only pieces of equipment that often cannot be relocated in the same location as what it's replacing because the tank sizes are increased. And so this is fine for new construction. Right in the bottom right corner, you can see you can kind of design around that. But if you're in an existing context, it's much more constrained. And sometimes there's not enough space for a larger tank to go into the same location. And that makes the garages a very attractive location if you're allowed to place things in your garages. Next slide, please. And so our zoning ordinance did not allow intrusions into required clear space in garages. And part of this is because there's no overnight parking allowed in Menlo Park. And so as part of the development review, there was a responsibility placed on the planners and transportation staff to make sure that when someone was developing a property or redeveloping, they preserved that parking space so that residents didn't run into an issue in the future with not being able to park on the street. And so only vehicles are allowed in these required clear spaces. And this varies from city to city. We did kind of a poll of our neighbors and found that, folks have, some different regulations. We were a little bit more on the stringent end of the spectrum. but identifying this barrier, we were able to kind of note it as we looked at the solutions. Next slide. The other piece that we ran into was, thinking about, okay, we need to preserve some parking, or there's places that don't have a garage, and so this equipment can't be located outside, but it could be located in a protective enclosure. And how do we make that flexible for existing buildings? And so we looked at the setbacks, right? Every property has required setbacks. They vary by zoning district, and certain equipment is allowed within them. So some things can be placed in there, like air conditioning compressors, heat pump condensers, pool equipment, things like that. But these protective enclosures that would be needed for the heat pump water heaters were not allowed within the setbacks. Next slide. And so in looking at that, right, we identified these are barriers that are housed in zoning ordinance. So to solve for that, we could change the zoning. And so as we set out about thinking about this, we asked 3 kind of guiding questions, right? Why are we making a change? How do we make the change? And what do we change specifically? Next slide. So for question 1, why are we making a change at all, right? So to kind of ground ourselves, we looked at this and said, we're trying to make it easier for residents in existing homes to electrify, right? We have tailwind of funding behind us. We have these goals and hopefully clean air ahead of us. And then these hurdles that we have identified directly ahead of us. And so that led us to question 2, okay, how do we make this change? And it was clear very, very early on that this was going to need to be a team effort, right? We're looking at very technical subject matter. It's a regimented process. And ultimately, it was something that from sustainability, right, we're going to have to hand this off to implementers in planning. And so we're fortunate at Menlo Park to have a collaborative bunch of very talented partners in planning, transportation, building, and in our city attorney's office. And so they all knew the process, and we were able to work with them. They aligned with the mission, right? They were on board, making it easier for existing homes to electrify. And then they were able to share their context and expertise to help. And I'll say, working together, we did not always agree, but we were able to disagree professionally with a focus on the goal, and then continue to use the process to present what we were trying to balance. And then check in to understand with the public and the commission where we had support. Next slide. And it took time, right? So you can see from the kind of initial conversations that we were having internally in June of 2022 through, the ordinance becoming effective after a 30-day wait today, woohoo, was about 18 months, right? And so that's reflective of a number of different things. In part, it's us, spending time to retool and bring it back to the various commissions that we needed to go to as we went through the process. In part, it's working through competing priorities. None of this work is happening in a vacuum. It would be great if we could, work on one thing at a time, but we can't. And so we're balancing that. We're also balancing, commission agendas. And just as an example, the planning division brought a housing element update, which is this massive undertaking right along the same timeline as this. And so, they're competing priorities and we're working together. And so we were very grateful to have their support in this while they're balancing that and all their other development review projects. And then we're competing for the same meeting space so that meeting agendas become quite tight, and you need to go through all of these steps. And the other thing is, again, using the process, we ended up with a much stronger ordinance because the input that we got from the Environmental Quality Commission and the Planning Commission expressing this desire to see more flexibility, less restriction, kind of expanding the things, that was able to help staff feel more comfortable and supported, and then ultimately the city council in adopting the changes. So really, really important. And it's an opportunity, right? You have to go through this process, but you also get to go through this process, and that can help you to make a stronger ordinance. And so what did we change? Next slide. Right, we had a narrow scope. We're looking at garages, setbacks. Let's identify the 2 places those are written down, find and replace, right? Well, it's not that simple. Next slide. as we looked at this, it became very clear. I have a background in planning, so I kind of knew a bit of this. But the ordinance is woven, right? There's these interlacing layers, and then you can have these different levers of application. And in working with our partners in planning, we actually found this to be to our advantage, right? So it was more complicated than we initially thought. But by identifying the proper levers, we were able to actually expand the scope of, which types of homes we were looking at. And so just by making some minor changes, folks in planning had said, hey, we could actually expand this to all existing units that have a dedicated garage fairly easily. And so that was a huge win for, our ultimate goal of trying to make it easier for more people to electrify. And then by workshopping with the planners, we were also able to find, additional hurdles that folks might run into down the line, because they have that context and they're working with this, they're reviewing these projects day in and day out. They know what's snagging projects, they know what might be required. And so by incorporating some changes to the development regulations to exempt the setback enclosures, we were able to smooth out the future. Next slide. And so, starting from this very narrow scope, we ended up creating a new section and modifying 9 other sections. And it was all in an effort to try to internalize as much complexity during this process that we were going through, so that it would be more simple for the implementers and ultimately for the residents and contractors who are working on behalf of our residents to help us do this work. Next slide. And now, effective today, but probably still working on some last minute implementation items, electric equipment can be located in existing garages and up to 2 3-foot by 3-foot areas. And next slide. And these protective enclosures for electric equipment are allowed to be located in the side and rear setbacks. And this is a huge win, and we think that between the 2 of these should provide enough flexibility that most existing homes will have at least one place that could work for them for the majority of the equipment that they're going to need to replace to electrify. Next slide. And finally, we learned a lot, and I think fortunately a lot of the things that we learned from this were from things that we did well and working together, right? I think teamwork and buy-in are super crucial. But it takes time, and so you need to budget for that. But the returns that you get on this are huge, because you're not only building an ordinance, but you're building relationships, and those are going to help you throughout implementation and for the next project and the next project and the next project. So really taking this time is very important and very rewarding, because you get to strengthen those partnerships. Zoning is technical, right? Building code amendments are technical. So partner with your technical experts. Workshop with the implementers. So many great ideas came from those workshops, and yes, it took a little bit of extra time to go to them with iterations. So we were grateful that they took the time to provide feedback. But it really was crucial to getting something stronger in the end. It's a design with the end in mind, right? Both thinking about implementation, but also once you know what you're going to be doing, what your process is looking like, start identifying those deliverables, right? Your presentation, you can use that in internal meetings. And then when you're ready to go to a commission or to the city council, it's just a quick revision to your slides, and then you're able to use that in a public setting. Also the same for your staff report, for your draft ordinance, for your resolution. Those things take a lot of time, and so they can be big lifts ahead of a meeting. But if you're able to kind of get things into those formats, then you can be nimble and you can be ready to go if something falls off a meeting agenda, which can happen, and so you want to be in the best position you can to go through that process. And again, use the process, right? It's an opportunity to get input, to get feedback, and also support as you're going through. And that support helps staff to feel more comfortable, taking bigger bites at changes. And it also helps your appointed or elected officials to support these when it does come before them for a vote. Remember, none of this work happens in a vacuum, right? So you're going to need to balance competing priorities and keep those open lines of communication with your partners, so that you understand when they're working on, big things that are kind of outside of your sphere of understanding. And consult your city attorney along the way. Make them a partner, because if you can bring like the shape of what you're thinking about to them early and kind of consult them along the way, that can work out very nicely. Was fortunate to get their eyes on things early. They don't want to surprise you as much as you don't want to be surprised in the 11th hour with something not working. So make them a part of the team. And then finally, just saying again, try to internalize as much complexity to simplify it for the external folks as you can, because ultimately, they're the ones who are going to be doing the replacements and doing the work that we have identified in our goals. So that's a huge piece. And we hope it works. We're going to be around, so if you have any questions at the break. Thank you.